Look around at the people in your life. Different skin tones, different hair, different shaped eyes, different heights, different faces that seem to belong to entirely different worlds. Now, here's the strange part. Every single one of them, every single one of us, traces back to the same small group of people who lived in Africa. Not similar groups, not parallel groups evolving side by side in different places. The same group. One family tree with roots so deep and so singular that it connects a farmer in Norway to a fisherman in Indonesia to a shepherd in the Andes. Somewhere back there, we were literally the same family. That's the mystery we're unravelling tonight. How does a species spread across every continent, adapt to ice and desert and jungle and tundra, end up looking so completely different from place to place, and still share one unbroken thread of ancestry running back to a single place on Earth? It sounds almost impossible. And yet it's written into our bones, our tools, and most convincingly into our DNA. The evidence is quiet. It doesn't shout. It waits patiently in fossil layers and genetic code for someone to notice it. And tonight, we're going to notice it together, slowly, calmly, piece by piece. I want to be upfront about something before we start drifting into this story. Science doesn't deal in absolute certainty, especially not when we're talking about events hundreds of thousands of years old. What you're going to hear tonight is the best supported story we have, built from fossils, from ancient DNA, from climate records buried in ice cores and ocean sediment. Some parts are settled fact. Other parts are still being debated by researchers right now, this year, this month. I'll try to be honest about which is which as we go. No wild claims, no pretending we know more than we do. Just a careful walk through what the evidence actually tells us, and where the mystery is still wide open. If you're here to fall asleep, welcome. That's exactly what this is for. Let my voice be the thing that fades into the background, while your mind lets go. And if you're enjoying these long, slow journeys through history, consider following the podcast version on Spotify. It's ad-free, music-free, just the story and my voice, nothing else competing for your attention as you drift off. There's a link in the description, and if you've got a moment before you fall asleep, a 5-star review helps this channel more than you'd probably guess. It costs nothing, and it means everything. One more thing before we begin. I love knowing who's listening and when. So drop a comment, tell me where you are, and what time it is right now for you. I read these constantly, and there's something almost poetic about it. Someone in Manila waking up for the day at the exact moment someone in Chicago is closing their eyes for the night. All of us connected through the same story, the same voice, the same slow unravelling of where we came from. So settle in. We're going to start in Africa, where this all began. Then we'll follow the waves of migration outward, the mixing, the adapting, the reshaping that turned one small population into 8 billion different faces. The clue was always there, hidden in every family tree. Let's go find it. Before we go any further into this story, we need to slow down on one phrase. Because we've been saying it casually, the way everyone says it. Humans come from Africa. But what does that actually mean? What are we really claiming when we say those words? Because the honest answer is more complicated and more interesting than most people realize. Let's start with a question that sounds simple but isn't. When you say something comes from a place, what do you mean? If I ask you where you come from, you might name a city, a country, a house you grew up in. But your parents came from somewhere else, and their parents came from somewhere else again. Keep going back far enough, and the question stops being about a place and starts being about a moment, a population, a thread of ancestry stretching back through generations you'll never know the names of. This matters because scientists use several different words that sound similar, but mean very different things. Origin, ancestry, population, lineage. They get used interchangeably in casual conversation, but in genetics and anthropology, each one is doing very specific work. An origin refers to where something first appeared or emerged. Ancestry refers to the biological line of descent connecting you to people who came before. A population is a group of individuals living and breeding together in a shared time and place. And a lineage is a continuous thread of descent, a line that can be traced through generations, sometimes branching, sometimes merging, always moving forward through time. When we say modern humans originated in Africa, we're making a claim about lineage and population. We're saying that if you trace every human alive today backward through their ancestry, all those threads converge on populations that were living in Africa, not converge on one single couple, not some biblical Adam and Eve moment, but on a network of populations related to each other, living across the continent, whose descendants eventually became all of us. This brings us to a distinction that trips people up constantly. The difference between the most recent common ancestor and all ancestors. These are not the same thing, and confusing them leads to a lot of misunderstanding. Your most recent common ancestor with, say, a stranger on the other side of the world is the single individual or population from which both of your lineages most recently diverged. But that person or population had their own ancestors, stretching back further and further into a much larger and messier family tree. When geneticists trace human origins back to Africa, they're often talking about the most recent common ancestors of specific genetic lineages, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, whole genome comparisons. Each of these can point to slightly different timeframes and slightly different population histories, because each one is tracing a different thread through the same tangled tapestry. Both matter. The recent common ancestors tell us about specific bottlenecks and migrations. The full ancestral picture tells us about the deep, branching complexity of where we truly come from. And here's something crucial that gets lost in the simplified version of this story. Africa is not one place. It's a continent 3 times the size of the continental United States, containing deserts, rainforests, savannas, mountain ranges, coastlines and river systems, each one home to different populations with their own genetic histories stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. When we say modern humans emerged in Africa, we are not describing a single Garden of Eden, one valley where everything began. We're describing multiple regions, multiple populations, possibly evolving somewhat independently before merging, splitting and merging again. Some recent genetic research even suggests that early human ancestry might trace back to several regions of Africa simultaneously, with populations in the south, the east and possibly other areas, all contributing to what would eventually become modern humans. The old idea of one small population in one specific spot is giving way to something messier and frankly more realistic. Deep regional diversity, not a single homogeneous source. There's another distinction worth making clearly, because it prevents a lot of confusion and a lot of misuse of this science. Biological origin is not the same as culture, nationality or identity. When we talk about ancient African populations as the ancestors of all humans, we are talking about deep biological history, hundreds of thousands of years old. We are not making claims about modern nations, modern cultures, or modern identities, which are recent, fluid, and shaped by countless historical and social forces that have nothing to do with ancient population genetics. Confusing these categories, treating deep ancestry as if it maps neatly onto modern identity, is a mistake that has caused real harm throughout history. The science tells us about biological lineage across immense timescales. It says nothing about culture, nothing about nationality, nothing about the richness of human identity as it exists today. So what's really happening underneath all this complexity is something more elegant than a simple family tree with one root. It's branching and blending together, lineages split apart, populations migrate, adapt, become distinct, and then, sometimes thousands of years later, they meet again and mix. Branches don't just grow outward forever. Sometimes they reconnect. And that pattern, splitting, wandering, rejoining, is going to matter enormously as we move forward into this story. If Africa isn't a single place, then why did so much of our story unfold there? Why does the trail of fossils, genes, and stone tools keep leading us back to this one continent, again and again? To understand that, we have to zoom way out in time. Before there were humans, before there were even hominins, there were primates. And for tens of millions of years, a huge chunk of primate evolution unfolded in Africa. Many of the early ape lineages we know about, the ones that eventually gave rise to humans, show up first in African rocks. Species like Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, Ardipithecus, then later the famous Australopithecines like Lucy. For more than 6 million years you can follow a kind of shadowy parade of increasingly human-like apes across different parts of the continent. Some walked a bit more upright. Some had slightly bigger brains. Some used simple tools. Most of them went extinct. But their fossils mark Africa as the long-term stage on which our branch of the family tree kept experimenting. By the time Homo erectus appears, around 2 million years ago, that stage is already crowded with evolutionary attempts. Erectus itself leaves Africa and spreads into Eurasia, but the pattern is clear. Whatever was happening in Africa was especially good at generating new hominin forms. It wasn't an accident, it was about the environment. Imagine a continent that is less like a single landscape and more like a vast, shifting puzzle. Wide savannas where grasslands stretch to the horizon, dotted with trees and huge herds of grazing animals. Dense tropical forests full of fruits, roots, and climbing opportunities. Long coastlines with tidal pools, shellfish and fish-rich estuaries. High plateaus and mountain ranges where the air is thin and temperatures swing sharply between day and night. Swamps, rivers, lakes, deserts, salt flats. All of this packed into one continent, constantly reshaped by changing climate. That kind of ecological variety is an engine for adaptation. Different environments reward different solutions. A group living in open savanna needs to see far, move efficiently, cooperate to hunt or scavenge, and avoid predators in the open. A group in forested highlands might rely more on climbing, foraging for specific plants, navigating complex three-dimensional terrain. A group on the coast can exploit tides, shellfish, seaweed, maybe even learn to time their foraging with the moon and the seasons. Now add another ingredient: instability. Over the past few million years, Africa's climate hasn't been stable and gentle. It has lurched back and forth. Wet periods when lakes swell and rivers braid across broad floodplains. Dry periods when those same lakes shrink or disappear. Grasslands turn to scrub. Forests retreat into isolated pockets. These swings didn't just happen once or twice. They repeated again and again, on timescales of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. For hominins, that meant the world around them was always changing. A region that was lush and habitable for a few thousand years could dry out and force everyone to move or die. A coastal wetland could transform into an inland plain. A forest corridor might fragment into tiny islands of trees surrounded by open land. This kind of resource patchiness is brutal, but it's also creative. It favours flexibility, groups that could shift diets, try new tools, explore new territories, and maintain social ties over distance had an edge. If your home valley failed, but you had kin or trading partners over the ridge, you had options. Mobility and innovation weren't luxuries. They were survival strategies. In that sense, Africa wasn't just a backdrop, it was an active participant in our evolution. The continent's mosaic of habitats and its relentless climate swings pushed populations to split, adapt to different niches, and then sometimes reconnect when conditions changed. One group might specialize in hunting large grazing animals on the savanna. Another might focus on fishing river channels. Another might become experts in extracting roots from hard, dry soils. When climates shifted, these groups could move, overlap, and mix, bringing different adaptations and ideas into contact. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this created a dynamic network of hominin populations, not a single origin point. Think of Africa not as a dot where humans began, but as a constantly rearranging patchwork of populations. Some in East African rift valleys, some in southern African coastal zones, some in central forests, some along northern corridors. Populations expanded when conditions were good, contracted into refuges when things went bad, moved, intermarried, separated, and repeated the cycle. This is also where we have to be honest about what we see and what we're missing. Part of the reason Africa looks like the primary stage for human evolution is that, geologically, a lot of its rocks are the right age and type to preserve fossils. The East African Rift, for example, is a kind of natural trap for bones and artifacts. Sediments pile up, volcanic ash seals layers, and later erosion exposes them just enough for curious primates with notebooks to find them. On top of that, Africa has been a focus of paleoanthropological research for over a century. Teams have gone back to the same valleys, caves and cliffs again and again, surveying, digging, refining dating methods. The more you look in a place, the more you tend to find. Other regions, like parts of Asia, have been less thoroughly explored or have geology and climate that destroy fossils more easily. That doesn't mean nothing important was happening there. It just means the record is patchier, and our picture is biased by where we've searched and what happens to preserve. So when we say early human evolution happened in Africa, it's really a shorthand for a more nuanced idea. Africa is where we've found the richest, most continuous record of primates turning into hominins, and hominins turning into something recognizably human. It's where the environmental stage seems to have been especially good at pushing our ancestors to be clever, social, and adaptable. But even within Africa, there was no single cradle. There were many cradles, many laboratories of evolution running in parallel. Different populations, living in different corners of this vast, diverse continent, were each solving their own local problems, weathering their own climate swings, inventing their own ways of surviving. Over time, some of those lineages died out, others merged. A few, just a few, gave rise to the populations that would eventually carry the name Homo sapiens. To follow them, we need to see more than stories. We need evidence. Bones, tools, ancient hearths, chemical traces of long-vanished lakes and campsites. In the next part of this journey, we'll walk into the deep past with the only guides we have, the fossils and artifacts that early Africans left behind, and the methods we use to pull dates and stories out of stone. To follow those guides, you have to think like a time traveller who doesn't get to see anything move. No living people, no running herds, no flowing rivers. Just layers of earth, scattered bones, broken stones, and the faintest chemical shadows of what used to be. So, how do scientists take that still, silent record and turn it into a timeline? They start with something very simple and very powerful, where things sit in the ground. This is stratigraphy, the study of layers. If you've ever looked at a road cut through a hillside and seen bands of different colours stacked on top of each other, you already understand the basic principle. Newer stuff in general lands on top of older stuff. Sediments wash in, volcanic ash falls, dust settles, rivers flood, caves slowly fill. Each event leaves a layer. When archaeologists and paleontologists excavate a site, they don't just grab whatever they see. They record exactly which layer it came from, how deep, what else was nearby. If a stone tool and an animal bone with cut marks are found in the same clearly defined layer, that's a clue they were part of the same moment in time. If a human skull is buried several layers below, it's older. If it's sitting higher up, it's younger. But knowing older and younger isn't enough. To tell our story, we need actual numbers. Was this occupation 50,000 years ago? 200,000? A million? That's where dating methods come in, and this is where the science gets both ingenious and a little humbling. One major family of methods is radiometric dating. Certain elements are unstable. They decay at predictable rates. Uranium turns into lead, potassium turns into argon, carbon-14 turns into nitrogen. Each does this at its own pace, measured in half-lives, the time it takes for half of the original atoms to decay. If you can measure how much of the original element is left, and how much of its decay product has accumulated, you can estimate how long the clock has been ticking. In volcanic regions of Africa, this is incredibly useful. Layers of ash and lava flows often sandwich the fossil-bearing sediments. Scientists measure the isotopes in those volcanic layers, methods like potassium-argon or argon-argon dating, and get ages like 1.85 million years or 780,000 years. The fossils and tools between those layers must fall somewhere in that window. For more recent periods, especially the last 50,000 years or so, radiocarbon dating comes into play. Living organisms constantly take in carbon, including a small amount of radioactive carbon-14. When they die, that intake stops, and the carbon-14 starts to decay. By measuring what's left in a piece of charcoal from an ancient hearth or a fragment of bone, scientists can estimate when that organism last lived. But not every site is lucky enough to have volcanic ash or preserved carbon. Sometimes the only things left are minerals in the sediments themselves. That's where luminescence dating steps in. Certain grains, quartz, feldspar, act like tiny solar panels. They trap energy from natural background radiation over time. When they're exposed to strong sunlight or heat, that energy is reset. When they get buried, the clock starts. In the lab, scientists can empty those energy traps with light or heat and measure how much has accumulated. That gives an age for when the grains were last exposed at the surface, often corresponding to when a sand dune formed, a hearth was last heated, or a layer of sediment was laid down over a campsite. None of these methods are perfect. They come with error bars. A date might be 100,000 years, plus or minus 10,000. Another method might say 90,000 plus or minus 5,000 to someone used to calendar dates. That sounds imprecise. But when you're dealing with glacial cycles and evolutionary change, a window of a few thousand years is often razor sharp. Scientists lean into that uncertainty. They don't try to wish it away. A well-dated site isn't one that gives a single magic number. It's one where multiple methods converge. Stratigraphy says the layer is older than the stuff above, younger than the ash below. Argon dating pins the ash at a certain range. Luminescence backs up the timing of the sediments. Radiocarbon, if available, fits neatly inside that story. When these independent clocks agree within their natural uncertainty, confidence rises. And when they disagree, that's where caution comes in. Instruments get recalibrated. Samples are rerun. Contamination gets hunted down. Sometimes, honestly, the age range stays wide, and scientists just have to live with it. The timeline of human evolution is stitched from overlapping patches of clarity and fog, not a neat, numbered ruler marching smoothly through time. But bones and dates are only part of the picture. Most of the time, bones are missing. Bodies decay, get eaten, dissolve, or never fossilize at all. If we relied only on skeletons, our story would be a handful of scattered ghosts. Stone, on the other hand, is stubborn. So are certain pigments and shells. Across Africa, long before we see clearly modern-looking skulls, we find stone tool traditions that change through time. Simple flakes and cores give way to more standardized points and blades. Tiny microliths appear, small, carefully shaped pieces that were likely hafted into composite tools, knives, and projectiles. By mapping where these tool types appear and how they evolve, archaeologists can trace movements and ideas, almost like following the spread of a language. Pigments tell another part of the story. At sites in southern and eastern Africa, chunks of ochre, iron-rich mineral that makes red and yellow colours, show up in layers over 100,000 years old, sometimes with grinding and scraping marks. In a few cases, pieces seem to be deliberately shaped or engraved. Even if we don't know exactly how they were used, body paint, hide treatment, symbolic marks, the repeated pattern whispers of people who cared about more than just eating and not being eaten. Marine shells, too, show up far inland or drilled as beads. They don't walk themselves there. Someone carried them, collected them, strung them. Through these small, durable objects, we glimpse behaviour, aesthetics, maybe even identity, in periods where human bones are few or absent. But interpreting any single site is a slow, careful process. There's a strong temptation, especially in headlines, to say, "This one jaw rewrites human history," or "This cave proves modern humans began here." The reality is almost always more modest. Researchers know that one fossil can be an outlier, one date can be off, one layer can be disturbed by burrowing animals or later humans. So they ask, does this site fit with what we see elsewhere? Does this tool type appear in multiple regions? Do other caves from the same period show similar pigments, similar shells, similar ways of knapping stone? Over time, patterns emerge not from a single spectacular discovery, but from many ordinary ones lining up. A jaw in one region, a skull in another, a series of dated hearths in a third, all begin to sketch the contours of a species that looks and behaves increasingly like us. And that's where we're heading next. With this toolkit, layers, clocks in the rocks, stubborn stone tools, and the quiet testimony of pigments and shells, we can finally walk up to some of the oldest faces that might belong to our own species. The fossils that are close enough to Homo sapiens to make us pause and ask, is this one of us yet? Or are we still looking at an ancestor, a cousin, a near miss? In the next part, we'll meet those candidates one by one, see where they were found, how they were dated, and what their bones hint about when and where beings we would recognize as human first stepped into the African light. If you laid them all out in a long, quiet gallery, the first thing you'd notice is that there isn't a single moment where faces suddenly become modern. There's no clean before and after line. Instead, there's a long, messy transition, a crowd of ancestors whose bones are just modern enough to make us do a double take. Some of the earliest contenders come from a place called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. For a long time, these fossils were thought to be maybe 40,000 years old. Then better dating of the surrounding sediments and burned flint pushed them way back, to around 300,000 years ago. The skulls from Jebel Irhoud are strange, in a familiar way. The faces are flat and tucked in under the forehead, like ours, not snout-like the way many earlier humans looked. The teeth are relatively small, the jawlines are more delicate. But the brain case, the back of the skull, is long and low, more like older species. Put hair and skin on these beings, and from the front they might pass in a crowd. From the side you'd notice the difference. Farther east, in Ethiopia, other candidates step out of the earth. Omo Kibish, near the Omo River, has yielded remains that are often called some of the earliest Homo sapiens. Some dating methods put them older than 190,000 years, maybe around 200,000 or a bit more. These skull fragments and bones look even closer to us. A higher, rounder brain case, a chin starting to emerge, a face that's fully tucked under the brain, not projecting forward. At her toe, also in Ethiopia, fossils around 160,000 years old show a similar pattern. The brain cases are big and rounded, the faces are quite modern. But there are still subtle archaic features, robust brow ridges, slightly thicker bones. The scientists who first described them even gave them a special label, Homo sapiens idaltu, a way of saying very early us, but not quite the final form. Further south and east, in places like Florisbad in South Africa, or maybe even earlier material in Nigeria and Kenya, we see the same theme, a mosaic. Some parts of the skull scream modern human, others whisper not yet. This is what researchers mean by mosaic evolution. Traits don't all upgrade at once like installing a new operating system. They appear in different combinations at different times in different places. A flatter face here, a rounder brain case there, a true chin appearing later on. Lighter skeletons, narrower pelvises, subtle changes in the inner ear, and the base of the skull that hint at differences in balance, posture, maybe even vocal tract shape. If you try to draw a neat line and say, everything on this side is Homo sapiens, everything on that side is something else, you quickly run into trouble. Jebel Ir-Hood has a modern-looking face, but an archaic brain case. Some East African fossils have very modern skull shapes, but hang on to robust features elsewhere. Southern African finds sometimes look like a halfway blend of older and newer patterns. This is why many scientists now talk about early Homo sapiens spread across Africa, rather than a single birthplace. Instead of one small Eden where modern humans popped into existence, we may be looking at a continent-wide process. Different regions, North Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, maybe even parts of Central and West Africa that haven't yielded many fossils yet, could each have been working on different parts of the modern human package. Populations separated by thousands of kilometers, but still occasionally connected by migrations and interbreeding, sharing genes and innovations over hundreds of thousands of years. In that view, modern humans weren't born in one valley on one lucky day. They coalesced gradually from a network of African populations, each carrying a piece of the puzzle. That's elegant, but it comes with controversy. What counts as anatomically modern? How much difference is too much? At what point is a brow ridge or a long skull just variation within our species versus evidence of something distinct? Part of the difficulty is that fossils are usually incomplete. A jaw without a cranium without a face, a fragment of the forehead, a few teeth, a piece of pelvis. It's like trying to reconstruct a person's entire life from a single old photograph and a list of shoe sizes. Different researchers also draw the boundaries differently. Some prefer a narrow definition. Only fossils with fully modern skull shape, small brows, a true projecting chin, and lighter skeletons count as anatomically modern. By that standard, clearly modern humans might not show up until around 200,000 years ago, or even later. Others take a broader view, including earlier, more mixed forms within Homo sapiens. They argue that evolution is a continuous process, and if a population is on the same lineage, constantly exchanging genes with later humans, maybe we should think of them as early members of our species, even if they still look a bit archaic. Underneath these technical debates is a more human question. What were their lives like? Those subtle anatomical shifts weren't just cosmetic. A rounder skull and expanded frontal regions hint at brain reorganization, potentially supporting more complex planning, social awareness, and language. A lighter skeleton changes how a body feels to move in, perhaps making long-distance walking and running more efficient, extending the range people could cover in a day. Narrower hips and changes in the birth canal may have altered the balance between babies being born relatively early and helpless versus staying longer in the womb. That in turn ties into childhood. A longer, more dependent childhood means more time for learning, more need for cooperation, more pressure on parents and relatives to share food and care. Smaller teeth and jaws suggest diets that included more processed food, meat cut with sharp tools, roots and grains pounded or cooked. Fire, grinding stones, and cutting tools would have taken over some of the work the jaws used to do. That frees up energy for other things: bigger brains, longer lives. The shape of the inner ear and the base of the skull affects balance and head posture, which influences how you move through a landscape, how you throw, how you carry children and objects. Changes in the rib cage and shoulders hint at different breathing patterns and arm use, which matter for endurance, tool use, and maybe even gesture and communication. And the skull isn't just a helmet for the brain, it's a billboard for social life. Faces capable of finer emotional expression, eyes set under a high forehead, slight chins and lips that can shape more subtle sounds. All of these play into how individuals signaled to each other, how they formed bonds, recognized kin, negotiated status, and comforted children. So when we look at Jebel Irhoud, Omo, Hato, Florisbad, we're not just assembling a checklist of modern versus archaic features. We're watching the slow assembly of a new kind of life history. Longer childhoods, more intense cooperation, broader ranges, more flexible diets, richer social worlds. These early Homo sapiens were not yet painting cathedral ceilings or building cities, but they were already carrying in their bones and brains the potential for everything that would follow. To see how that potential shows up not just in skulls and skeletons, but in the invisible code carried inside every cell, we have to turn from fossils to another kind of record entirely, the genetic one, written in mutations and shared ancestry, quietly ticking along for hundreds of thousands of years. When geneticists look at our DNA, they're doing something very similar to what paleoanthropologists do with skulls and bones. They're looking for patterns. They're asking, where is there more variety? Where is there less? And what does that say about time? One of the simplest and most powerful observations is this: human genetic diversity is highest in Africa. If you take a group of people from one region of Africa and compare their DNA, and then take an equally sized group from, say, Europe or East Asia and compare theirs, the African group will, on average, show more differences from person to person. More variation in the code. Why does that matter? In population genetics, high diversity usually signals two things: a large population size over a long period of time. Think of mutations, little copying errors in DNA as tickets being dropped into a giant jar. The longer you keep dropping tickets, and the more people are passing the jar around, the more different tickets you'll find inside. If a group splits off from that big jar and takes just a small handful of tickets with them, they'll start out less diverse. That's what we see outside Africa. Every non-African population looks like a subset of African diversity, as if a small group of Africans walked out, carrying only a fraction of the genetic variation with them, and then expanded. This is the classic out-of-Africa bottleneck, a narrowing of diversity when a branch of the population leaves, followed by growth. But not all DNA tells the story in the same way. There are different clocks ticking in our cells, and each has its own quirks. One of the first clocks scientists learned to read is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are the tiny energy factories inside your cells, and they have their own little ring of DNA separate from the chromosomes in the nucleus. You inherit your mitochondria almost entirely from your mother. That means your mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, traces a single line. mother to child, to child, to child, back through time. Because it doesn't recombine the way most of your DNA does, mtDNA is relatively simple to map. You can draw branching trees of maternal lineages, see which kinds are most common, and estimate when they split from a shared ancestor. When researchers did this for people all around the world, the deepest branches of the tree, the oldest splits, were all in Africa. All non-African mtDNA lineages sit on twigs of that larger African tree. This is where the phrase mitochondrial Eve came from. Not a literal first woman, but the most recent common ancestor of all living human mitochondrial lineages. The key here is most recent, and of this particular piece of DNA, there were many women alive at the same time as her. She just happens to be the one whose maternal line didn't die out. The same logic applies on the paternal side with the Y chromosome. The Y is passed from father to son. It also doesn't recombine over most of its length, so it carries a clean record of branching male lineages. Again, when geneticists reconstruct the global Y chromosome family tree, the deepest, most ancient branches are in Africa. All non-African Y lineages are nested inside a larger African pattern. People sometimes talk about a Y chromosome Adam to match mitochondrial Eve. But just like her, he was not the only man alive, and he didn't live at exactly the same time she did. These names can be misleading. They don't imply a single couple or a biblical starting point. They're just labels for the points where all living male line or female line branches happen to converge. And they're limited. Your mother's mother's mother and your father's father's father are just two lines out of thousands of ancestors you have at any depth in the past. If you go back 1,000 years, you have potentially millions of genealogical ancestors. Make DNA and Y each track only one narrow strand through that web. To get a fuller picture, scientists look at autosomal DNA, the 22 pairs of non-sex chromosomes that you inherit half from each parent. This is where most of your genes live, and where recombination shuffles things every generation. Each time sperm and egg form, the two copies of each chromosome mix and swap segments. Over time, this creates a mosaic. Your autosomal DNA is a patchwork quilt sewn from thousands of ancestral threads. Analyzing this quilt is more complex. Instead of neat trees, you get overlapping signals, shared segments, similar patterns of variation, statistical clusters. By comparing how often certain variants appear together, and how they're arranged along the chromosomes, geneticists can infer which populations have been exchanging genes, which have been isolated, and roughly when splits and mixtures occurred. Autosomal data tells the same broad story as mtDNA and the Y, but with more nuance. It confirms that the greatest overall variation is within Africa. It shows that non-African populations carry only a subset of African genetic diversity, consistent with a relatively recent expansion out of an older African base. It maps waves of mixture between Africans and non-Africans, between modern humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans that mtDNA and the Y sometimes miss. Underpinning all of this is the idea of a molecular clock. Mutations don't happen on a metronome, but they do happen at roughly predictable average rates. If you know on average how often a certain kind of mutation occurs per generation, and you count how many such differences separate two lineages, you can estimate how long ago they diverged. This is where things get tricky. Mutation rates can vary between regions of the genome, between species, even between different human populations. They may speed up or slow down over evolutionary time. Different studies use different calibration points, fossils of known age or known historical splits, and get slightly different answers. So when you see headlines about the date of mitochondrial Eve or the timing of the out of Africa expansion. Those numbers usually come with margins of error and underlying assumptions. Is she 150,000 years old? 200,000? Did the main out of Africa wave happen 50,000 years ago? 70,000? The exact figures shift as methods improve and new data arrives. What doesn't shift is the overall pattern. No matter which reasonable mutation rate you pick, the deepest roots of our species' genetic tree lie in Africa. The oldest branches of both maternal and paternal lineages are African. The richest tangle of autosomal variation is African. Non-African genomes look like younger offshoots, pruned by a bottleneck and grafted onto an older African trunk. When you put that genetic story next to the fossil record, the early Homo sapiens skulls at Jebel Ehud, Omo, Hato, Florisbad, and beyond, something reassuring happens. These are independent lines of evidence. One is written in bone and stone, the other in molecules inside living cells. They use different methods, different assumptions, and different kinds of data. And yet they converge. Both say, by a few 100,000 years ago, a lineage we can reasonably call early Homo sapiens was taking shape across Africa. Both say the main expansion of that lineage into the rest of the world happened much later, involving only a small fraction of the total diversity. There are still gaps, disagreements, unresolved puzzles in both records. But when fossils and genes start humming the same tune, even in different keys, it's hard to ignore, to follow that tune beyond Africa's borders. We have to watch what happens when some of those African lineages finally step out onto new ground, across deserts, along coastlines, over narrow seas. That's the story of how, and when, our ancestors first began to leave the continent that shaped them. So when did that actually happen? When did some small part of that deep African tangle of lineages gather its belongings, follow a river, walk along a coastline, and quietly become non-African? If you open a textbook, you'll often see a clean number, around 60 to 70,000 years ago. That's the most widely accepted window for the major successful dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa, the one that gave rise to almost all present-day people living in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. But like most things in deep time, the closer you look, the less it resembles a single date, and the more it looks like a messy series of experiments. Some of the earliest hints of humans outside Africa appear much earlier than 60,000 years ago. There are stone tools and possible Homo sapiens fossils in the Levant, Israel, Lebanon, surrounding regions around 180,000 to 120,000 years ago. There may be early sapiens-like remains in Greece and China that are even older. These finds are controversial, debated, revised as new techniques come in, but they all point in the same general direction. People like us didn't stay perfectly penned inside Africa. Whenever climate and geography allowed, they seem to have pushed out, tested new lands, explored new ecologies. So why don't those early excursions show up strongly in the DNA of most living people? Why does our genetic story outside Africa look so heavily focused on that later 60-70,000 year window? This is where we have to think like both an ecologist and a geneticist. Imagine a small group leaving Africa during a warm, wet phase, when the Sahara is green and the Middle East is dotted with lakes and rivers. They move into the Levant, maybe further into Southwest Asia. For a few thousand years they might do well. Then the climate shifts. The rains move, grasslands shrink, deserts expand, rivers dry up. Their population is never huge to begin with. A few bad generations, droughts, disease, competition with other hominins, and that branch can simply fade away. From a genetic point of view, fading away doesn't necessarily mean every last descendant vanishes. It can also mean their lineages get swamped. Picture a tiny population of early migrants living somewhere in the Near East. Later, a much larger wave of migrants arrives from Africa, tens of thousands of years after the first. They carry their own set of genetic variants. If they mix with the earlier group, but vastly outnumber them, their genes will dominate the future gene pool. Over time, the earlier signatures get diluted until they're statistically almost invisible. It's like pouring a cup of coloured dye into an ocean. Technically, it's there. Practically, you're never going to notice it. This is what people mean when they say an early movement might be genetically overwritten. It's not that it never happened. It's that later, larger events left a much louder echo in the DNA of people alive today. Climate is the big conductor of this whole process. For most of the last few 100,000 years, the Sahara hasn't been a single permanent wall of sand. It's flipped between being a barrier and a bridge. During dry glacial phases, it expands into a hostile zone of dunes and bare rock. During humid green Sahara episodes, monsoon rains push north, rivers and lakes appear, and the desert blooms into grassland and savanna. Each wet phase opens a migration corridor. Herds of animals move, lakes fill, plants spread. Human groups can follow those resources out of the heart of Africa toward the Sinai, the Arabian Peninsula, even across into southern Asia. When the climate swings back toward dry, many of those corridors slam shut again. Populations get trapped, squeezed or squeezed out. The same pattern plays out further east. Periods of higher rainfall can turn parts of Arabia into habitable grassland, open routes across Iran, Central Asia, and along the Indian Ocean rim. Then, as conditions worsen, those routes narrow or break. Populations contract into refuges or wink out, so instead of imagining the out-of-Africa moment as a single heroic trek, it's more realistic to picture multiple pulses, human waves moving out during climatic windows, some stalling and dying out, others hanging on, still others later being absorbed into bigger flows. This brings us to one of the central questions in modern human origins research. Did all non-Africans come from one main exit, or multiple independent exits? One model says there was a big, dominant dispersal event around 60,000–70,000 years ago, maybe along a southern coastal route, and that's the one that matters for almost everyone alive today. Earlier excursions into the Levant, or even into parts of Asia, were side stories whose genetic traces are minimal or lost. Another model suggests a more braided stream. Perhaps there were several substantial waves out of Africa, separated in time, but overlapping in space. They may have mixed with each other and with local Neanderthals and Denisovans. What we see today in our genomes would then be the blended product of multiple exits, mergers and replacements. How do we choose between these pictures? How do we tell whether the world's non-African populations descend from a single major migration or from multiple waves? To get at that, scientists have to weave together three different kinds of evidence. First is archaeology: stone tools, ornaments, hearths, butchered bones, and the rare but precious human fossils themselves. Their dates and locations show when and where modern humans, or at least their technology, appear outside Africa, and whether those appearances are continuous or sporadic. Second is ancient DNA. In a handful of cases, we can extract genetic material directly from ancient bones and teeth, or even sediments. These genomes act like time-stamped snapshots of past populations. They let us see whether people living in, say, Europe 45,000 years ago were part of the same broad expansion as people in China 40,000 years ago, or whether there were distinct, now extinct branches. Third are population models. Using computers, geneticists simulate different scenarios: a single out-of-Africa pulse, 2 or 3 staggered waves, early expansions that mostly die out, later ones that succeed. They tweak population sizes, migration rates and bottlenecks, then compare the simulated genetic patterns to the real ones observed in thousands of modern and ancient genomes. The models that best reproduce the data are taken as the most plausible stories. None of these lines of evidence is perfect on its own. Archaeology can show presence but not always ancestry. Ancient DNA is rare and biased toward certain regions and climates. Models are only as good as the assumptions they're built on, but together they let us test ideas instead of just telling stories. In the next section, we'll follow those ideas outward, along the actual paths our ancestors likely took, the coasts, the river valleys, the narrow sea crossings that turned a single African homeland into a global human web. When people talk about humans leaving Africa, they often imagine a single path, like a highway painted on a map. In reality, there were at least 2 big doors and probably more side entrances, half-open gates and back alleys. One door was to the north. This is the Levant route out of northeastern Africa across the Sinai into what is now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. A land bridge, no swimming required. When the Sahara was green and the eastern Mediterranean was mild, this was a perfectly walkable corridor. Rivers, lakes, herds of gazelle and wild cattle, patches of woodland. For earlier hominins like Homo erectus, this was likely the preferred path, and it remained important for later humans too. The other door was farther south, hugging the Indian Ocean rim. In this picture, small groups of Homo sapiens slip out of eastern Africa near the southern Red Sea, cross into Arabia, then follow coastlines and near-coastal plains along the shores of the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, all the way towards Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. Not a straight line, not in one go, but a chain of habitats strung like beads along the edge of continents. Both routes have evidence, both have problems, and both are almost certainly part of the story. The northern Levant corridor has the clearest early archaeology. We actually find early Homo sapiens looking fossils there, and tools that look a lot like those from Africa. It feels like a natural extension of the African stage into Southwest Asia. But remember, those early occupants may have been evolutionary experiments that didn't leave a large genetic legacy. The southern coastal route, by contrast, has more indirect support. Genetic studies often suggest a rapid spread of modern humans along southern Asia sometime after about 60,000–70,000 years ago. Very early human presence shows up in places like Australia by around 50–65,000 years ago, depending on which dates you accept. To get that far that fast, a path following productive coasts and estuaries makes sense. But the direct evidence for those early coastal camps is frustratingly thin. One big reason is simple: sea level. During the peak of the last ice age, and during many glacial periods before, enormous amounts of water were locked up in ice sheets. Global sea levels were lower, sometimes by more than 100 meters. That means the shorelines our ancestors walked along aren't where today's beaches sit. They're out under the waves, buried in sediments on continental shelves. Imagine the coast of East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, when sea level was much lower. Wide coastal plains, river mouths pushed far out, lagoons and estuaries teeming with fish and shellfish. These would have been prime real estate for small human bands. Fresh water from rivers, marine food from tidal flats, land animals on the inland side. If you're following those resources, you're not marching next to the cliff edge like in a movie. You're meandering across a broad, flat zone that is now submerged. Your hearths, your temporary shelters, your discarded tools, most of them are underwater today. That's why the archaeological record can feel lopsided. Inland routes, like the Levant corridor, have preserved sites we can dig. Many early coastal routes are effectively hidden under the sea or eroded by waves. The absence of evidence there isn't very informative. It's like trying to reconstruct a story from a book where half the pages have fallen into a lake. But whether our ancestors took the northern corridor, the southern coasts, or both at different times, the basic requirements for long journeys were the same. They needed technology, not high tech, but enough. Containers to carry water, skins, woven plant fibres, maybe shells. Simple boats or rafts for short crossings, logs lashed together, dugout canoes, anything that could float people, and a bit of cargo across narrow straits. Fire-starting methods reliable enough that you didn't have to pray for lightning every time you wanted cooked food. They needed knowledge, where to find seasonal springs, which plants are edible or poisonous, how to read animal tracks and bird migrations. On a days-long or weeks-long trek between reliable water sources, a single mistake could kill everyone. That kind of route memory doesn't live in one brain. It lives in stories, in teaching, in shared mental maps of the land. And above all, they needed social systems that could handle risk. If you're going to send a scouting party into an unknown valley, you have to be able to spare those people. If one group has a bad hunting year, they need allies they can visit, trade with, or marry into. Cooperation isn't a nice extra. It's the difference between a band that dies out at the edge of a desert and a band that keeps pressing forward, leaving descendants scattered across half a continent. This is where founder effects come in. Imagine a tiny group, maybe 30 or 50 people, several extended families, managing to cross a bottleneck of geography. A narrow isthmus, a mountain pass, a strip of habitable coast between deserts. Once they're through, they find a region with little competition and plenty of resources. Over generations, their descendants fill that space. From the perspective of deep time, that pinch point, the few dozen who made it through, becomes the ancestral core for a huge future population. 10,000 years later, there might be tens of thousands of people in that region, all ultimately descended from that thread of survivors. Expand that timescale to 40 or 50,000 years, and that one small founding group can stand behind millions. Genetically, this creates a signature, reduced diversity, certain variants becoming common simply because they were present in the founders. That's part of what we see in non-African populations today. Echoes of small founder groups that crossed out of Africa, then multiplied dramatically. But tying those genetic patterns to specific roots is hard. Did the key founders walk out via the Levant and then swing east? Did they hug a lost shoreline of the Red Sea, then the Arabian Sea, then the coast of India? Did different waves take different paths, overlapping, interbreeding, and replacing one another in complex ways? The honest answer is that our ancestors probably used every viable path available at different times. When the Sahara was green and the Levant was lush, the northern corridor would have been busy. When monsoon patterns shifted and coastlines offered rich, stable resources, the southern routes would have drawn people along them. Early pulses may have favoured inland river systems. Later pulses might have leaned more heavily on coastal foraging and short sea crossings. What we see today in bones, in tools, in DNA, is the blurred composite of all those journeys. No single road, no single crossing, no single heroic migration. Just countless small decisions, to follow a herd a little farther, to camp one valley beyond the usual range, to risk a short paddle across a calm strait, step by step, coast by coast, corridor by corridor. Those choices carried a few African lineages outward until out of Africa wasn't a direction anymore. It was simply the starting chapter of a much larger story. In the next part, we'll meet the other humans waiting along those routes, the Neanderthals and Denisovans who were already there when we arrived, and who would leave their own traces inside our genomes. When that small group of Homo sapiens walked out of Africa for good, They weren't stepping into an empty world. The lands they entered were already occupied, not by strangers exactly, but by close cousins who had been evolving outside Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. To the north and west, across the Levant and deep into Europe, lived the Neanderthals. They weren't cartoon cavemen, they were Ice Age specialists, the descendants of those early human lines that had pushed into cooler climates long before modern humans existed. Stocky bodies to conserve heat, powerful limbs, big noses that acted like built-in humidifiers, and brains at least as large as ours on average, sometimes larger. They knew their landscapes, the way desert nomads know dunes or sailors know currents. Which valleys funneled migrating herds, which caves stayed dry, where to find flint in winter. They buried their dead, they cared for injured group members, they made tools so standardized that archaeologists can spot a Neanderthal toolkit from fragments of stone alone. Farther east, stretching across much of Asia, were the Denisovans. They're more shadow than flesh in our story, known mostly from fragments of bone and teeth in a Siberian cave, and more importantly, from DNA. If Neanderthals were the western branch of our cold climate cousins, Denisovans were their eastern siblings, occupying everything from forests to mountains to island chains. We don't yet have their full portrait, no complete skeletons, no museum reconstructions. But we know they were successful, because echoes of their genes show up today from mainland Asia all the way to Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia. They were not a footnote, they were a major human presence in Asia long before Homo sapiens arrived. So when our African lineages spilled out into Eurasia roughly 60,000–70,000 years ago and later, they were not pioneering untouched continents. They were walking into territories that already had names in someone else's language. This is where the word interbreeding comes in. Genetically, interbreeding just means this: two populations that have been separated for a while meet again and have children together, and those children are fertile. Genes from one group flow into the other, and vice versa. Over generations, pieces of DNA from both sides get shuffled together, like two decks of cards merged, cut, and reshuffled again and again. For a long time people assumed modern humans simply replaced Neanderthals and Denisovans without mixing. Two clean storylines, one in Africa, one in Eurasia, and then one brutally pushes the other aside. But when scientists started reading whole genomes, that clean separation dissolved. Almost every person today whose ancestry traces mostly outside of Africa carries small fragments of Neanderthal DNA. On average, about 1 to 2% of the genome in Europeans, Asians, and many other non-African populations comes from Neanderthals. It's not the same 1 to 2% in everyone. Different people carry different pieces. But when you add up all those fragments across millions of people, you can reconstruct a large part of the Neanderthal genome just from the shadows they left inside us. In some regions of the world, especially parts of Melanesia, Aboriginal Australia, and some Southeast Asian populations, there is something extra layered on top of that: Denisovan ancestry. Depending on the group, 3 to 5%, sometimes more, of the genome appears to descend from these mysterious Asian cousins. Other Asian populations carry smaller but still detectable amounts. This mixing didn't happen in a single romantic encounter in a cave somewhere. Genetic evidence points to multiple episodes in different places and at different times over tens of thousands of years. Small bands of Homo sapiens meeting small bands of Neanderthals in the Levant. Later, other groups further north or east. Still others overlapping with Denisovan populations somewhere in Asia, again and again, as waves of migration and shifting climates brought them into one another's orbits. Why does this matter for the question, do all humans come from Africa? Because it can be confusing. If non-African people have Neanderthal and Denisovan genes, doesn't that mean we come from Europe and Asia too? Doesn't that contradict a single African origin? It doesn't. Think of it this way. The core ancestry of all living Homo sapiens still traces back to African populations. The basic structure of our genome, the deepest splits in our family tree, the line that separates our species from all other hominins, that line is African. That's what Out of Africa is about, where Homo sapiens emerged as a distinct species. Interbreeding adds something on top of that core. It's like taking a book written in Africa and then, as it travels, scribbling notes in the margins in Neanderthal ink, adding a few Denisovan footnotes in the later chapters. The original text is still African. The annotations are Eurasian. And those annotations weren't random. Some of them seem to have been useful. Scientists talk about adaptive introgression. That's when genes from one group enter another group through interbreeding and stick around because they help with survival. There are hints, strong hints in some cases, that Neanderthal and Denisovan variants did exactly this. Certain Neanderthal-derived genes in modern humans appear to influence aspects of our immune system. They may have helped newly arrived Homo sapiens cope with Eurasian pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites, that African populations hadn't encountered. Not every borrowed gene was helpful. Many were likely neutral or even mildly harmful and were slowly filtered out. But a few seem to have given a real edge. From Denisovans, one of the clearest examples involves altitude. A genetic variant associated with high-altitude adaptation in modern Tibetans appears to have a Denisovan origin. It affects how the body responds to low oxygen, helping people live and reproduce efficiently on the Tibetan plateau, where the air is thin and many unadapted visitors struggle. That doesn't mean Denisovans invented mountaineering, but it does suggest that when our lineages met them in or near high-altitude regions, some of their hard-won adaptations crossed species boundaries. There are other candidates, genes involved in fat metabolism, in how we respond to cold, in skin and hair biology. The details are still being worked out, and not every claim will hold up. But the broad picture is becoming clear. When modern humans met their cousins, they didn't just trade mates. They traded solutions, genetic answers to local problems, and yet none of this erases the African origin of our species. If you strip away those Neanderthal and Denisovan segments, what's left is still recognizably Homo sapiens, and that recognizable form first took shape in Africa. The interbreeding events were real, important, and fascinating, but they are side currents feeding into a river that began its course on the African continent. So, when you hear that everyone outside Africa has Neanderthal ancestry, or that some populations carry Denisovan genes, it's not a contradiction. It's the sequel. Homo sapiens came out of Africa carrying an African genome, met long-lost relatives along the way, and picked up a few of their genetic tricks before continuing on. In the next part of the story, we'll watch what happened after those encounters, how small founding groups drift and local adaptation slowly sculpted the incredible range of human diversity we see across the world today, all still rooted in a single ancient African beginning. When those early groups of Homo sapiens left Africa, they didn't carry the full genetic deck of the continent with them. They carried a subset, a sample, and what happens to a species when only a small sample walks away is one of the quiet engines behind human diversity. Geneticists have a simple phrase for this: founder effects. Imagine a huge library with millions of books. That's Africa during the late Pleistocene. Hundreds of thousands of people, scattered but connected, carrying a rich mix of genes. Now imagine you're allowed to take just one small backpack of books and sail to a new island. Whatever ends up in that backpack becomes the basis for the new island library. You might randomly grab 3 books on astronomy, 1 on gardening, and nothing at all on ancient history. Not because ancient history disappeared from the world, but because it just didn't happen to be in the bag when you left. In evolutionary terms, those first small bands leaving Africa were the founders of new populations in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Europe, in Australia, in the Americas. Each band carried only a fraction of the genetic variation present in the larger African source populations. Some gene variants simply didn't make the journey. Others, by pure chance, were overrepresented. That's founder effect. When a new population starts from a tiny group, random chance decides which genes get copied into the future and which quietly vanish. Now, let that process run for tens of thousands of years in lots of different places, and something else starts to happen. Genetic drift. Drift is evolution without direction. No goal, no improvement, just randomness playing out over time. In a small population, chance has a loud voice. One person with a rare gene has 3 surviving children instead of 1. Another person dies in an accident before having any. Slowly, just through these accidents of birth and death, some gene variants become common and others disappear. You don't need selection for that. You just need finite numbers and time. So as human bands fanned outward, north into the cold, east into the forests and mountains, south along coasts, and eventually across oceans, 2 quiet forces shaped their genomes every generation. Founder effects at the beginning, and drift as the group stayed relatively small and somewhat isolated. On top of that, something very different was happening. Natural selection. Drift is random, selection is not. Natural selection is the process by which traits that help you survive and reproduce in a particular environment tend, over generations, to become more common. Move into a region where the sunlight is intense year-round, and dark skin rich in melanin helps protect you from DNA damage and folate loss. Over many generations, gene variants that produce darker pigmentation become more frequent, not because they're better in some cosmic sense, but because they are better for that place. Move into regions with weaker, more seasonal sunlight, and you meet the opposite problem, vitamin D. It's harder to synthesize in low light. In those environments, lighter skin allows more ultraviolet light to penetrate and helps produce enough vitamin D for healthy bones and immune function. Here, over long spans of time, variants for lighter pigmentation are favoured. That's why skin colour today roughly tracks latitude and UV exposure with plenty of local twists. It's not an ancient division between separate races. It's a relatively recent, flexible response to the physics of sunlight on a spinning, tilted planet. Hair, too, carries climatic stories. Tightly coiled hair, common in many African populations, creates a sort of insulating air-filled layer above the scalp, helping protect the head from overheating in intense sun. Straighter, heavier hair, more common in many northern Eurasian populations, may help retain heat and shed water in cold, wet climates. Again, not hard boundaries, not single genes dictating destiny, but gentle nudges from local environments acting on many genes at once. Some of the most striking examples of recent human evolution aren't visible at all. They sit in our guts and our immune systems. Take lactose tolerance. All mammal babies drink milk. Almost all mammals, including most humans through most of history, lose the ability to digest milk sugar, lactose, after weaning. The gene that makes the lactose-digesting enzyme usually switches off in childhood. But in a few regions of the world, parts of Europe, East Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, something unusual happened. People domesticated animals like cows, goats, sheep, and camels, and they didn't just eat the meat. They drank the milk. Fermented milk products like yogurt and cheese reduce lactose, making them easier to digest. But in some populations, a mutation arose that kept the lactase gene switched on into adulthood. Adults could drink fresh milk without getting sick. In societies where milk was a reliable food and water source, That small genetic tweak was a big survival advantage. Those who could drink it had more surviving children. Over just a few thousand years, that lactase persistence mutation shot from rare to common. That's natural selection in fast forward, tied directly to culture. If those societies had never started herding animals and milking them, the mutation would have been meaningless. A biological change that only mattered because of a cultural habit. The same pattern shows up with disease resistance. When people began living in larger, denser communities, farming the same fields year after year, storing grain, living closer to their own waste and to domesticated animals, they changed the disease landscape. New epidemics became possible. Malaria, for example, placed intense selection pressure on populations in tropical regions. Variants like the sickle cell trait, harmful in some combinations, protective against malaria in others, rose in frequency because on balance they helped more people survive in malarial zones than they harmed. Again, culture and biology were tangled together. How people lived, what they ate, how they farmed, where they settled, reshaped which genes were useful. So human diversity is the result of several overlapping stories, the accidents of founder effects, the slow coin toss of genetic drift and the sharper chisel of natural selection, all interacting with culture, our tools, our diets, our settlements, our ways of life. But there's a perspective shift that matters here. Most of the visible differences people fixate on, skin colour, eye shape, hair form, lactose tolerance, altitude adaptation, are evolutionarily young. Many are on the order of tens of thousands of years old, some even younger, arising and spreading long after Homo sapiens had already emerged in Africa as a distinct species. If you zoom out to the scale of 1,000,000 years, they're thin surface paint on a very old structure. Genetically, any two humans on Earth are astonishingly similar. There is more genetic variation within many single populations in Africa than between entire continents elsewhere. The deepest branches of our family tree are African, and they're shared. The regional differences that people see, and sometimes obsess over, mostly sit on the outermost twigs. All of us, whether our recent ancestors herded cattle on African grasslands, farmed rice in Asian river valleys, hunted reindeer under Arctic skies, or followed maize across the Americas, are variations on a single theme that was composed long ago on the African stage. In the next part of the story, we'll follow some of those branches eastward into Asia, watching how those same forces, founder effects, drift, selection and culture, played out as humans filled almost every environment that vast continent had to offer. When those first small bands of Homo sapiens stepped out of Africa and into Eurasia, Asia wasn't a blank map waiting for their footprints. It was already a complicated stage, with Neanderthals in parts of the west and Denisovans somewhere in the east, and a shifting patchwork of forests, deserts, mountains and coasts that changed as the ice ages pulsed in and out. But over time, wave after wave of our species filtered through this vast space, following rivers, hugging shorelines, cutting across plateaus and valleys, until almost every corner that a human body could survive in had at least been tried. The earliest part of that story is hazy, especially in South Asia. Fossils are rare, bones dissolve in the humid tropics, and rising seas have drowned the ancient coasts where many people likely lived. What we do have are scattered stone tools and a few contentious bones and teeth. In places like India's Narmada Valley and the Thar Desert, archaeologists have found tool traditions that look like they belong to early Homo sapiens, or at least to people very close to them, dating back maybe 100,000 years or more. In Sri Lanka, a tropical rainforest island off India's southern tip, there are cave sites suggesting human occupation tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone once thought people could handle that kind of dense, humid jungle. The problem is, dating rocks and sediments is one thing. Tying them securely to a particular kind of human is another. Techniques like optically stimulated luminescence can tell you when grains of sand last saw sunlight. Uranium series dating can estimate the age of cave formations. But if the bones are gone and only a handful of stone flakes remain, you're left inferring, does this style of toolmaking match what we know from securely dated Homo sapiens elsewhere? Or are we looking at Denisovans, or late surviving archaic humans we haven't even named yet? Asia is full of questions like that. It's a continent of almosts and maybes, of ghost populations whose DNA we glimpse in modern genomes, but whose faces we've never seen. Even with those gaps, a broad outline has emerged. One major corridor seems to have run along the southern fringe of Asia, from the Arabian Peninsula through what is now Iran and Pakistan, skirting the foothills of the Himalayas, down into India, and onward toward Southeast Asia. This southern route would have offered something precious to small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers: continuity. Coasts, river mouths, and lowlands where food and fresh water could often be found, even as the climate swung between wetter and drier phases. For some groups, the coast itself became a lifeline. Imagine shorelines before modern cities, before ports, before seawalls and landfills, long arcs of estuaries and mudflats, mangroves and beaches rich in shellfish, fish, seabirds and edible plants. People who learn to time the tides, understand currents, and exploit marine resources could move quickly along these edges, leapfrogging from one rich patch to the next. Others moved inland, following river systems like the Indus and the Ganges, the Irrawaddy and the Mekong. River valleys were different worlds. Seasonal floods replenished soils. Fish moved up and down with the rains, and plant life exploded along the banks. Later, these would become some of the great cradles of agriculture. Long before that, they were highways and supermarkets rolled into one. Still others pushed into highlands and plateaus. In places like the Tibetan Plateau or the uplands of Southeast Asia and southwestern China, thin air, cold nights, and unpredictable weather demanded different strategies. You needed knowledge of seasonal pastures, of sheltered valleys, of plants that could survive short growing seasons. Natural selection worked here too, tuning bodies to cope with low oxygen. The genetic signatures of those ancient adaptations still circulate in some highland populations today. Same species, same African origins. But by the time you look across Asia, you're seeing radically different lifeways shaped by local ecologies. Along tropical coasts, diets heavy in fish and shellfish, perhaps early experiments with simple watercraft, and seasonal movements tied to monsoons and tides. In river valleys, growing use of floodplain resources, root crops, and perhaps early plant management, long before full farming. In forests, expertise in tracking animals through dense vegetation, using poisons, storing fat-rich foods, and navigating with mental maps where distant landmarks were hidden by leaves. In highlands, small, tightly connected groups with deep knowledge of seasonal cycles, migration routes for animals, and safe passes across treacherous terrain. The archaeological record hints at this variety, but again, it's patchy. Caves preserve things, open-air camps often do not. Rising sea levels since the last glacial maximum have swallowed vast stretches of the ancient Asian coastline, erasing whole chapters of the story. Genetics helps fill some of those gaps, but it doesn't simplify the picture. It complicates it. For a long time, people imagined a neat sequence, a single out-of-Africa wave crossing into the Middle East, then fanning out in different directions, each region settled once and then left mostly alone. Asia refuses that simplicity. Genetic studies suggest multiple pulses out of Africa, some earlier, some later. Some may have fizzled out, leaving little or no trace in present-day populations. Others appear to have mixed with Denisovan-like groups in Southeast Asia, leaving behind fragments of DNA that are still found in some island and mainland populations today, especially in places like Papua New Guinea and parts of the Philippines. Then, long after those first pioneers had spread east, later migrations swept back over the same ground. Farmers moving out of what is now China carrying rice and millet. Pastoralists from Central Asia bringing horses, wheels and new languages. Groups expanding out of the fertile crescent of West Asia with wheat, barley and new disease packages. At every step, people met, traded, fought, intermarried, and sometimes displaced each other. What looks today like a local Asian population, whether in South India, coastal Vietnam, the mountains of Laos or northern China, is usually the product of many layers laid down over tens of thousands of years. Early hunter-gatherers mixed with Denisovan-inflected groups, then with farmers from one direction, then with herders from another, then with later waves of movement in historical times. Ancestry, here more than almost anywhere else, is a palimpsest, a manuscript written, scraped, and written over again, never fully erasing what came before. As we follow these lines farther southeast, the map itself starts to fragment. Peninsulas turn into island chains, shallow seas separate land masses that were sometimes connected during Ice Age low stands and sometimes cut off by water. Beyond a certain point, walking won't be enough. To reach some of the lands humans eventually settled, places like Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that once linked Australia and New Guinea, you have to build something that floats, trust it, and push off from shore. Asia's deep story leads us right to that threshold, the edge of the continent, the last spit of sand before open water. On the far side lies Oceania, where human history takes one of its boldest turns. People who had started out walking the African savannas becoming, for the first time, true ocean crossers. To get from Asia to Sahul during the Ice Ages, you didn't have to cross the Pacific. But you did have to do something no humans had ever done before. You had to lose sight of land. During the coldest phases of the Pleistocene, sea levels were far lower than today. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were fused into a single vast landmass we call Sahul. On the Asian side, many of today's islands were joined into another supercontinent, Sunda, which included what is now mainland Southeast Asia, Sumatra, Borneo, Java and surrounding shelves. You could walk a long way across peninsulas that are now seafloors, through river valleys that now lie drowned under tropical seas. But even at the lowest sea levels, there was always a gap, a stretch of deep water between Sunda and Sahul that never turned into dry land. Crossing that gap meant building watercraft that weren't just for short rivers or sheltered lagoons. It meant planning a journey where, for at least part of the time, there would be no reassuring strip of coastline on the horizon, just water, sky, and whatever you believed was waiting beyond. The timing of that first leap is one of the great puzzles of human prehistory. Most researchers place the first settlement of Sahul somewhere around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. Some sites in northern Australia like Madjed Beeb have produced dates on the older end of that range, with stone tools and other traces that many archaeologists accept as evidence of early Homo sapiens in the region. But there are debates. Dating methods have margins of error. Sediments get disturbed. Older material can be moved into younger layers. A date in a lab is never the same thing as watching someone walk ashore. What we can say with some confidence is this: by around 50,000 years ago, people were living in Australia, New Guinea, and the islands in between. And because those islands were never fully connected to Asia, getting there required deliberate sea crossings. How exactly did they do it? Two main models compete, and reality might be a mix of both. One route follows what's called the Northern Path, island hopping from Borneo towards Sulawesi, then down through smaller islands to New Guinea. Another follows a more southern path, threading through Java, then eastward across the Lesser Sunda Islands toward northern Australia. Computer simulations of winds, currents, and ancient coastlines suggest that under some conditions, rafts or simple boats that drifted accidentally could have ended up on Sahul. But those same models also show that reaching Sahul repeatedly, in numbers large enough to found stable populations, is far more likely if people were paddling on purpose, aiming for visible island silhouettes, reading stars, swells, and bird flight. The archaeological record on many of those stepping stone islands is frustratingly thin. Tropical climates, volcanic activity, and rising seas have erased or buried many early sites. We have more absences than presences, more they must have passed somewhere near here than clear continuous trails of camps and hearths. Genetics and geography, though, both converge on the same conclusion. This wasn't a one-off accident. Sahul was settled early, and once people were there, they stayed. On that isolated landmass, evolution and culture had room to run in new directions. Australia's interior deserts, tropical north and temperate south posed very different challenges. New Guinea's mountains and dense rainforests were another world again. Over tens of thousands of years, populations spread out, adapted, and became increasingly specialized in their local environments. Cut off by deep water from Eurasia, they didn't experience the same later waves of gene flow that repeatedly washed over Europe and much of Asia. That isolation is written in DNA today. Many indigenous Australian and Papuan populations carry genetic lineages that split off early from other non-African groups and then diverged largely on their own. But the story isn't pure isolation. It's also one of ancient entanglements. Remember the Denisovans, that shadowy sister species whose traces show up across parts of Asia? Some of the highest levels of Denisovan-related ancestry in the world are found today in Papuan and some other Oceanian populations. This doesn't mean Denisovans themselves ever lived on Sahul. More likely, early modern humans carrying Denisovan DNA mixed with other groups somewhere in Southeast Asia before, or as they moved towards Sahul. Different fragments of Denisovan-like DNA in different modern populations suggest there were probably multiple Denisovan groups and multiple episodes of interbreeding. People headed towards Sahul appear to have run into one or more of those groups, absorbed useful genes, some of them linked to immune function and environmental adaptation, and then carried those genetic echoes across the sea. So the first Sahulians weren't just bold navigators. They were also carriers of a complex genetic legacy, shaped by encounters with other humans long before they saw Australian shores. Once on Sahul, deep time unfolded. In Australia, long-running archaeological sequences and rich oral traditions among Aboriginal peoples point to cultural continuity on a scale that is almost hard to grasp, tens of thousands of years in the same landscapes, telling stories about rivers, cliffs and animal behaviours that match features and patterns scientists can independently date. In New Guinea, some of the earliest evidence for plant cultivation and landscape management comes from highland valleys where people were experimenting with yams, taro and other crops long before the great river civilizations of Eurasia built their first cities. Here too, isolation didn't mean stagnation. It meant a different trajectory. Much later, another chapter of Oceanian seafaring began, layered on top of the first. Starting maybe 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, groups speaking Austronesian languages began expanding out from somewhere in island Southeast Asia, likely Taiwan and adjacent regions, in a remarkable burst of voyaging. They developed sophisticated canoes, navigation systems, and maritime cultures that carried them through the Philippines, Indonesia, coastal New Guinea, and out into remote Oceania, Micronesia, Melanesia, and eventually Polynesia and parts of Madagascar far to the west, where those Austronesian voyagers met the descendants of the first Sahul settlers, especially along the coasts of New Guinea and nearby islands. Genetic and cultural mixing followed. Today, many island populations in this region show a blend of deep Papuan-related ancestry and more recent Austronesian ancestry, layered like geological strata. The key point, though, is that the Austronesian expansion was not the first wave into Oceania. It was a later overlay, remarkable in its own right, but built on foundations laid tens of thousands of years earlier by people whose names we'll never know, but whose courage we can infer from the map itself. From Africa's savannas to Asia's coasts, from Sunda's flooded plains to Sahul's ancient shores, humans had now proven something new about themselves. They weren't just land animals adapting to local niches. They were becoming a species that could look at a stretch of ocean, except that they didn't know exactly what was on the other side, and go anyway. That willingness to cross thresholds, to leave known lands, risk deep water and trust knowledge handed down through generations, would shape the next great chapters of our story too. Because while Sahul was one of the earliest frontiers, it wasn't the last. Far to the northwest, in icebound Europe, another dramatic experiment in human survival was unfolding, one that would be written in glaciers, cave walls, and the DNA of people who later came back when the ice retreated. When your ancestors first looked toward Europe in the late Pleistocene, they weren't seeing a continent like the one on modern maps. They were seeing ice. For long stretches of the last few 100,000 years, massive ice sheets smothered much of northern Europe. Glaciers thousands of meters thick spread out from Scandinavia and the Alps, grinding mountains, rerouting rivers, and pushing anything living southward. Between those icy walls and the warmer Mediterranean lay a narrow, shifting zone where humans could actually survive. Cold steppe, open grasslands, tundra-like plains, herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, wild horse, short summers, brutal winters, storms that could erase tracks and lives overnight. Climate, more than anything else, decided who could live where. As the ice advanced, habitable zones shrank, forests retreated. Animals and people were squeezed into patches of land where conditions stayed just tolerable enough. When the ice pulled back, those patches became launching pads for expansion into newly opened territory. Archaeologists have a word for these safe pockets: refugia. Think of them as emergency shelters for ecosystems and cultures. During the coldest peaks of the Ice Age, much of Europe was either under ice or so harsh that long-term human presence was limited. But some regions stayed relatively milder. The Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy and the Balkans, sheltered river valleys in what's now France or the Carpathian region. In those refuges, small populations of humans, first Neanderthals, later modern Homo sapiens, hung on. They hunted local herds, sheltered in caves and rock overhangs, and passed down survival knowledge through generations that may never have seen the wider continent their ancestors had once roamed. Then the climate shifted, not overnight, not like flipping a switch, but in pulses and waves. Ice sheets thinned, glaciers retreated upslope, new plants colonized the freshly exposed ground. Game animals followed, and each time conditions improved, humans moved. From those refugia, people expanded north and east, tracking rivers, coastlines and herds into lands that had been uninhabitable only a few centuries earlier. When conditions worsened again, they retreated, sometimes all the way back to the same old refuges, sometimes into new pockets that happened to be less battered by the cold. Over tens of thousands of years, this rhythmic advance and retreat turned Europe into a laboratory of demographic change. Groups split, moved, mixed or disappeared, Villages and hunting bands that had occupied the same valley for centuries might be replaced by newcomers with different tools, different ornaments, maybe even different stories about what the world was. For a long time, archaeologists tried to read this story almost entirely from stones and bones. In the Upper Paleolithic, the period roughly from about 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, Europe's archaeological record becomes rich in material traces. Blade-based stone tools, bone points and needles, personal ornaments made of shells, teeth and ivory, cave paintings and carved figurines that have become icons of Ice Age Europe. You might be tempted to see each tool style, each art tradition, as the fingerprint of a specific people. A new kind of stone point appears in the record. Perhaps a new population arrived. A figurine style fades away, maybe its makers vanished. Sometimes that connection might be real, sometimes it might not. Technologies can spread through learning as well as through migration. Art styles can shift within a continuous population. Two unrelated groups can converge on similar solutions just because they face similar environments. The truth is, stones alone rarely tell you who someone's ancestors were. That's where ancient DNA changed the game. Over the last 2 decades, researchers have managed to extract and sequence genetic material from human remains found in Ice Age European sites. Teeth, bits of bone, sometimes just fragments that would have seemed unremarkable a generation ago. When those genomes were compared, a striking pattern emerged. Europe wasn't populated once, and then gradually diversified in place. Instead, it seems to have gone through multiple waves of population turnover. In some regions, an early modern human group appears in the record, leaves a genetic footprint, and then, after a big climatic downturn, or a few thousand years of absence, is replaced by a different genetic lineage. In certain areas, Neanderthals occupy a region, are briefly joined or replaced by modern humans, and then for a while modern human DNA disappears again, only to return later with different ancestries. The map of Ice Age Europe, viewed through DNA, looks less like a steady family tree and more like overlapping brushstrokes. Populations push into a region during favourable climates, thrive for a time, then contract or vanish when conditions become too harsh. Later, new groups, sometimes related, sometimes only distantly so, move back in from refuges and recolonize the same ground. One major turnover appears to have happened after the coldest phase, known as the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. Before this peak, certain genetic lineages dominate the European record. After the ice retreats, many of those early lineages are scarce or gone, replaced by descendants of groups that likely sheltered in southwestern and possibly southeastern Refugia during the worst of the cold, then surged out as the climate warmed. Down the line, there were more changes. Remember the earlier chapters involving Neanderthals. Before modern humans fully established themselves in Europe, Neanderthals had occupied many of its habitats for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving exquisitely to cold climates. When Homo sapiens began entering Europe in larger numbers, there was a period of overlap, contact, interbreeding, and competition. A portion of the genetic legacy of that time still lives in most people of European descent today, in the form of small Neanderthal-derived segments scattered across their genomes. But as a distinct population, Neanderthals themselves eventually disappeared, somewhere around 40,000 years ago, during one of these turbulent climatic and demographic swings. Whether climate stress, direct competition, disease, low population sizes, or some combination of all of these tipped the balance remains debated. Fast forward to the end of the Ice Age. As glaciers finally retreated and forests spread back across Europe, the continent was repopulated yet again by hunter-gatherer groups whose genetic signatures show multiple strands of ancestry, some rooted in those old refuges, some carrying threads that trace back to Western Asia. And the story didn't stop there. Around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, new migrants entered Europe from the southeast. These were early farmers carrying domesticated plants and animals that had been developed in the Fertile Crescent. Ancient DNA reveals that many of them were genetically distinct from the foragers already in Europe, closer to populations in Anatolia and the Near East. Over millennia, these incoming farming groups mixed with local hunter-gatherers to varying degrees in different regions. In some places, early farmers seem to have largely replaced local foragers. In others, hunter-gatherer ancestry bounced back, blending with farming lineages to create new genetic mosaics. Layer by layer, Europe's human landscape was rewritten. Ice Age climates had first carved the continent into refuges and frontiers, turning survival into a dance between advancing ice and shrinking safe zones. Post-glacial expansions then sent waves of people back over old ground, sometimes carrying lingering Neanderthal echoes in their DNA, sometimes bringing completely new ancestries and ways of life. What looks on a modern map like a single block labelled Europe is, in deep time, a palimpsest, a repeatedly erased and rewritten surface where Neanderthals, early modern hunters, post-glacial foragers, and incoming farmers each left traces. And all of those layers, no matter how complex, still connect back to the same distant origin. The people sheltering in an Iberian valley at the height of the last glacial maximum. The artists painting bison on cave walls, the first farmers walking slowly up the Danube with bags of seed grain. Each of them was carrying chromosomes that had passed through that ancient African bottleneck, through the branching of lineages in Africa, through early expansions into Eurasia, through encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Europe's Ice Age refuges were just one more set of temporary shelters along a much longer journey, a journey that was about to cross another threshold, into lands no human had seen before, the vast cold spaces on the far side of the Bering Land Bridge and the continents we now call the Americas. By the time your ancestors were staring out across what is now the Bering Strait, most of the rest of the world was already spoken for. Africa had hosted the entire story so far. Eurasia had been explored, abandoned, recolonized, and layered with multiple waves of ancestry. Australia and the islands of Sahul had been reached by seafaring people tens of thousands of years earlier. The Americas were the last major landmass to enter the human story. And, fittingly for the final chapter of a planetary migration, the details are messy, contested, and still being rewritten. The broad outline is this. During the colder phases of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. When that happened, the shallow continental shelves between northeastern Asia and what's now Alaska were exposed, creating a vast stretch of dry land we call Beringia, not a narrow bridge. A continent-sized region, windy, cold, but rich in steppe tundra grasses, shrubs and the animals that fed on them. Somewhere in this landscape, populations of modern humans with ancestry, ultimately rooted in Africa, made their way north out of Eastern Asia. They followed rivers and coastlines, tracked herds, and at some point they crossed into Beringia and stayed. The debates begin immediately. One leading idea is the Beringian standstill model. In this view, a small population of ancestral Native Americans made it into Beringia, then became effectively trapped for thousands of years. To the west, glacial and climatic barriers limited easy movement back into Siberia. To the east, two massive North American ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, blocked access to the rest of the continent. In that frozen cul-de-sac the population sat, isolated, accumulating its own genetic signatures. Another idea emphasizes a relatively brief pause in Beringia, followed by earlier or more flexible movements along the Pacific coast. In this coastal model, People might have skirted the southern margins of the ice, using boats and shore-based resources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, kelp forests, to move much faster than interior routes would allow. Part of the problem is that both potential pathways, inland and coastal, have been heavily edited by time. The interior ice-free corridor that once ran between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets wasn't open, habitable, and biologically productive for the entire late Ice Age. It opened and closed, sometimes choked with ice and meltwater, sometimes supporting plants and animals humans could have followed. Pinning down exactly when it was truly passable to migrating families, not just hardy caribou, is an active line of research. The Pacific coast is even trickier. Any shoreline that early seafarers would have used is now mostly underwater. Rising sea levels after the Ice Age drowned ancient beaches, campsites, and landing spots beneath dozens of meters of ocean. Wooden boats, woven nets, and coastal shelters were made of materials that rot quickly. So the very evidence that would clearly prove or disprove a coastal highway has been erased or hidden. This is why dates and routes for the first entry into the Americas remain contentious. Genetic studies of living indigenous peoples and of ancient remains where communities have permitted analysis point to a scenario in which ancestral Native American populations diverged from other Asian groups roughly between about 25,000 and 20,000 years ago. Then, sometime after that split, a subset of those people moved into and beyond Beringia, giving rise to the diverse lineages now spread from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. Archaeological finds sometimes seem to push hard on those timelines. Sites in both North and South America have been proposed as being older than 20,000 years, even older than 30,000. Some of these claims, when re-examined, turn out to be natural breakage patterns mistaken for tools, or disturbed sediments that make the dates unreliable. Others remain intriguing but controversial. To avoid overclaiming, researchers increasingly cross-check evidence. If a very early archaeological site is real, do the stone tools match known technologies from plausible source populations in Northeast Asia? Do the dates line up with periods when Beringia and inland or coastal routes would actually have been usable? Does ancient DNA from nearby remains, if any, exist? And if communities agree to testing, show ancestries that make sense in the larger picture of population splits and expansions? When the genetic and archaeological lines agree, confidence grows. When they don't, people go back to the field and the lab, revisiting assumptions. What almost everyone converges on is that once humans did get past Beringia's bottleneck, the spread through the Americas was astonishingly rapid on a continental scale. Within a few thousand years, a blink measured against the hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors had spent just within Africa. People were living in nearly every major environment the Americas offered. Arctic and subarctic coasts, where later Inuit and related groups would refine ice edge hunting to an art. Temperate forests teeming with game and edible plants. The open Great Plains and pampas, where herds of large mammals once roamed. High Andean plateaus, where some populations evolved adaptations to thin air, reminiscent of those found on the Tibetan plateau, echoes of Denisovan-influenced genes long before, back in Eurasia. Dense Amazonian forests, where complex knowledge of plants and rivers became the key to survival. As these populations spread, they diversified. Different languages emerged, then branched again. Tool traditions adapted to local resources. Some groups developed early forms of plant tending and domestication, maize, beans, squash, potatoes, laying the foundations for later urban societies like the Maya, the Inca, and the civilizations of central Mexico. Others retained mobile, foraging lifeways adapted to arid basins, forest edges, or northern coasts. Genetics, where it's been ethically studied, shows a tapestry of related lineages fanning out, and then differentiating, but all traceable back through Beringia to East Asia, and then further back, through multiple branching paths to Africa. This is the crucial point. The settlement of the Americas is late in the global timeline. When the first people were walking along Alaskan river valleys or camping on Chilean coasts, their distant relatives had already been in Europe, Asia, and Australia for tens of thousands of years. But those American pioneers were not a separate creation, not an independent origin of humanity. They were another branch of the same African family tree, carrying the same fused chromosome that emerged during that ancient bottleneck, the same deep-time genetic signatures shaped by earlier encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans. The last great continental expansion, in other words, was not a new beginning. It was the final wave of a journey that had started hundreds of thousands of years earlier, in African refuges your ancestors barely escaped. And the story didn't stop when humans reached the farthest tip of South America. Migrations would continue to flow not just out of Africa but back into it. The map of human movement is not a single arrow pointing away from one cradle, but a tangled web of paths, some of which loop home again. So let's follow one of those looping paths. We've been talking about out of Africa as if it were an arrow, one decisive move, a great dispersal, and then the rest of the story happens somewhere else. Reality is messier. After those first major exits, people didn't just keep walking away from Africa forever. Some of them turned around slowly, indirectly, over thousands of years, and their descendants went back. Geneticists can see this in the DNA of present-day Africans. Certain stretches of genome that are most common today in the Middle East or Europe show up in diluted form inside African populations, but with timestamps attached. Patterns of mutations, recombination, and how those segments are chopped up by generations of mating tell us they arrived at different times. Some signals point to very ancient returns, maybe more than 40,000 or 50,000 years ago, when early Eurasian groups, still closely related to their African cousins, drifted back across the Sinai or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Others point to movements in the last 10,000 years, associated with herders, farmers and traders. Still others are quite recent on an evolutionary clock, linked to historical periods we can read about in inscriptions and chronicles. It's not one back migration, it's a series of them. A long, slow reign of ancestry falling back onto the continent that first sent it out. Imagine the Red Sea region and the Sahara, not as walls, but as filters and corridors. People on both sides of the Nile, both sides of the Red Sea, both edges of the Mediterranean, were never permanently cut off from each other. They traded obsidian, shell, salt, incense, metals, livestock, grains. And along those routes, over generations, traders became in-laws became grandparents, and genes crossed borders with as much determination as caravans. Pastoralist groups, people who lived with and for their animals, were especially mobile. Cattle, sheep, camels and goats can turn marginal land into food if you keep them moving. Herders drifted with their flocks between the Horn of Africa and Arabia, across the Sinai into northeast Africa, through the Sahel that rims the desert from west to east. Those movements didn't happen once. Wet periods opened up green corridors, dry periods pushed people toward rivers and coasts. Each climatic swing, each shift in trade demand, reshaped who was meeting, marrying, and raising children together. Later, in historical times, the layering became even more complex. Phoenician and Greek traders frequented North African coasts. Roman soldiers, administrators, and slaves moved in both directions across the Mediterranean. Arab conquests and Islamic trade networks tied West Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, and beyond into a vast circulation system of people and goods. The Indian Ocean became a human highway, carrying sailors and settlers between East Africa, southern Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. All of these flows left traces in African genomes. You can see Near Eastern ancestry in some North African and East African groups. You can see South Asian signals in certain coastal communities linked to Indian Ocean trade. You can see back migration from Eurasia mixing with older African lineages in the highlands of Ethiopia and the Nile Valley. But here's the crucial thing. None of this erases where the story started. Back migration adds layers. It doesn't rewrite the foundation. When geneticists say everyone ultimately comes from Africa, they're talking about the deepest branching points in our family tree. The place where the line that leads to all living humans first clearly separates from other now extinct hominin lineages. The home of that ancient bottleneck with the fused chromosome. The region where our species as a single interbreeding population had its formative history. Those roots don't move just because later branches twist back over the trunk. This also helps explain something that confuses a lot of people, how Africa can have the greatest human genetic diversity, even though some non-African ancestry has flowed back in. Diversity isn't just about how many different ancestries are present right now. It's about how long populations have been accumulating differences, how large and structured they were over time, and how many independent lineages have been able to coexist. African populations had the longest continuous history, the biggest and most complex web of subgroups, and never went through the same kind of severe, global-scale founder effect that hit the first small groups leaving the continent. When a tiny subset of Africans walked out into Eurasia, they carried only a sample of the older variation with them. That sampling effect means non-African populations, as a whole, start with less genetic variety. Later admixture back into Africa might introduce some new combinations, but it's being poured into a reservoir that was already deep. Think of Africa's diversity as a vast, ancient library. The out-of-Africa migrants took a limited number of books with them. Outside, they wrote new chapters, even whole new volumes, and some of those come back and get shelved in the original library. Interesting additions important for local histories, but the bulk of the collection was already there. So when we say everyone comes from Africa, we aren't telling a story of a single heroic march in one direction. We're summarizing a tangled pattern, early origins on one continent, multiple exits, side paths, and then, over and over, returns. People left, changed, and some came back, carrying with them traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan encounters, new technologies, and new genes. They added threads to an already intricate African tapestry, but the loom itself had always been there. Understanding this makes the phrase "we all come from Africa" both more accurate and more interesting. It's not a slogan about purity or a one-way journey. It's a reminder that even when humans ranged across the globe, the connections never fully broke. Lines of kinship, trade and migration kept looping back, tying the world's story to its oldest stage. And to really grasp what those ancient origins can't tell us on their own, we have to look beyond genes entirely. We have to listen to languages, follow myths and music, and trace cultures as they rise, blend and change. Genes can tell us where our ancestors' bodies have been. They can't by themselves tell us what our ancestors thought, believed or called themselves. That's where a lot of confusion comes in. When people hear "we all come from Africa," some immediately jump to modern categories. Does that mean everyone is the same race? Does that mean all African cultures are original and everything else is a copy? Does that say anything about language, religion, or national identity? No. Genetics is powerful, but it speaks a very specific language. It deals in mutations, population splits, and shared segments of DNA. It doesn't recognize countries. It doesn't care what language you speak. It has nothing to say about which gods you pray to, what stories you tell your children, or what you call home. You can be genetically close to someone whose culture feels completely foreign, and you can be genetically distant from someone whose language and traditions feel perfectly familiar. Consider language. The family trees linguists build for languages often look a bit like genetic trees, with branches and splits and common ancestors. Indo-European, Bantu, Austronesian, Afro-Asiatic. It's tempting to line those trees up with DNA and assume they tell the same story. They don't. Languages can leap from group to group without carrying many genes with them. A small number of people can impose or simply spread their language over a much larger population, and within a few generations, the DNA of the majority will look mostly like the old inhabitants, while the language comes from the newcomers. This has happened again and again. In some parts of the world, people speak Indo-European languages, but carry a great deal of ancestry from older local groups who spoke very different tongues. In others, Bantu languages spread widely across Africa. Yet archaeological and genetic evidence shows deep roots of earlier hunter-gatherer and pastoralist populations still present in the genome. The tongue changed faster than the blood. The reverse can happen too. Genes can travel quietly, without language tagging along. A few traders, enslaved people, refugees, or marriage partners can move into a community, leave descendants, and over centuries their genetic contribution can become detectable. But if they adopt the local language quickly, and if their numbers are small, there may be no linguistic trace at all. Two neighbours might speak closely related languages because of recent cultural contact, yet one may carry significant ancestry from a distant region, introduced long ago, while the other does not. Culture muddies the straightforward lines we like to draw. Technologies behave the same way. Farming, metalworking, sailing, writing, these can race across continents faster than populations expand. You don't need to replace a whole community to change the way it lives. You just need ideas to move. A stone worker from one valley sees a better way to shape blades in another. A potter copies a new style. A group of herders observe how their neighbours manage drought and adopt the practice. The genes barely shift, but the culture transforms. By the time you're looking at the archaeological record, you might see a big change in tools or housing or diet, and be tempted to imagine a wave of invaders. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's simply a wave of imitation, trade and learning. This is why using genetics in history takes care. DNA is incredibly good at certain questions. Did these two populations mix? Roughly when? Are they descended from a small group or a large one? Does a present-day community carry ancestry linked to some ancient skeleton in a cave? For deep time it gives us anchors that language and legend can't. Mitochondrial lineages, Y chromosome branches, the fused chromosome from that ancient bottleneck. These are hard to fake. They let us test which migration stories are plausible and which are not. But DNA is not a script of human meaning. It cannot tell you what people called themselves, what counted as us and them, which myths they told around their fires, or how they ranked their own differences. It can't tell you if a migration felt like conquest, marriage, exile, or opportunity to the people living through it. It also has blind spots. Ancient DNA is easier to recover in cool, dry places than in tropical forests or humid coasts. Present-day sampling is uneven, shaped by politics and access. And the same genetic pattern can sometimes be explained by different historical scenarios. So when we reconstruct the human past, the safest route is to braid lines of evidence together. Genes tell us about shared ancestry and mixture. Languages tell us about long-term communication and cultural continuity. Archaeology tells us about technologies, diets, and ways of life. Oral traditions, myths, and written records tell us how people understood themselves. Where all these lines converge, we can be fairly confident. Where they diverge, we know the story is still unsettled. For our African origins, the convergence is unusually strong. Fossils, tools, and DNA all point in the same direction. A deep, formative history on one continent, followed by waves of expansion and return. But how exactly those early humans thought of their own identities, how they divided us from them, which languages they spoke, and how those changed as they moved, that remains in many ways a mystery. In the final part of this journey, we'll pull the threads together. We'll look at what seems solid, what is still debated, and how much of the out of Africa story we can tell with confidence, and where we have to lie back, accept the darkness between the data points, and live with unanswered questions. When we step back from all the details, a pattern emerges from very different kinds of evidence, collected by different kinds of scientists, using different methods. The arrows keep pointing to the same place. Africa, not as a slogan, not as a political statement, but as a quiet conclusion that falls out of the data again and again. Fossils first. The oldest clearly modern human skeletons we've found so far. They're African, Ethiopia, Morocco, South Africa. Faces and skulls that with a haircut and a change of clothes wouldn't look out of place on a crowded street today. Their dates line up in a particular window, roughly 300,000 to maybe a bit earlier. Then younger fossils that show more and more of the traits we call modern tools and artifacts back this up. The earliest known examples of behaviourally modern humans, carefully shaped blades, tiny points for complex weapons, pigments probably used for body painting or symbolic marks, beads and ornaments, cluster in African sites before they appear anywhere else. The technological and symbolic package that feels familiar to our species shows up there first, then spreads outward. And DNA sits on top of all this like a timestamp and a family tree rolled into one. When geneticists trace the branching patterns in our genomes, when they run models of population size and separation, they keep finding a long, deep history within Africa. A big, structured population there for hundreds of thousands of years. Lineages splitting and reconnecting inside the continent, like a braided river. Then, much later, a subset of that diversity leaving Africa and giving rise to all non-African populations. Every ancestor outside Africa, if you follow their line back far enough, disappears into that older African web. That's the part we can say with unusual confidence. But inside that broad picture, the lines get blurry again. We don't yet know the exact patch of ground where the first fully modern humans stood. The evidence doesn't point to a single Eden, a magic valley where everything began. Instead, it suggests multiple regions of Africa contributing to what would become Homo sapiens. Some researchers imagine a pan-African origin model. Separate populations in East, North, South, maybe even Central Africa, connected by waves of migration and mixing. Traits we think of as modern human might have appeared in different places at different times, then spread through this network gradually, rather than blooming all at once in one homeland. If that's right, then asking the birthplace of our species is a bit like asking for the single house where the internet was invented. The reality is a tangle of contributions, spread in space and time. We're also still uncertain about the fine-grained timing of the earliest exits. There were likely earlier movements of Homo sapiens out of Africa that didn't leave many descendants. Fossils in Greece, Israel, and perhaps China hint at early excursions far beyond the continent, over 100,000 years ago. These may have been pulses that fizzled out, hemmed in by climate swings, competition, or simply bad luck. Then there's the later, more successful expansion around 60 to 70,000 years ago, the one that seeded most of today's non-African populations. Exactly how those early waves relate to each other, how many there were, and how much they mixed when they met, those are still active debates. And inside Africa itself, during those long millennia before the big dispersals, the population structure remains one of our largest open questions. Were there a few large, well-connected populations exchanging mates and ideas across vast distances, or many small, semi-isolated groups, occasionally coming into contact, swapping genes, then drifting apart again? The genetic signals we see today can be explained by different combinations of these scenarios. Ancient DNA from African fossils is rare and fragile, and living populations carry the imprint of more recent events layered on top of older ones. Untangling those layers takes patience, new methods, and more discoveries. This is where new finds matter. Every time a new skeleton is dated, a new cave is excavated, or a new genome is sequenced, our timelines shift a little. A fossil pushes the presence of modern humans in a region back another 20,000 years. A genetic study shows that a certain population split earlier or later than we thought. A tool tradition appears in a place where we didn't expect it. When that happens, headlines often say things like "human origins theory overturned" or "everything we knew was wrong," but that's mostly noise. What's really happening is refinement. The big picture, deep African roots, later global dispersal, repeated mixing with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic groups has stayed remarkably stable as the details get sharper. New discoveries usually adjust dates, roots, and relationships inside that framework, not replace it altogether. Think of it like an old map. At first, you just see a continent's outline. Then, as explorers return, the coastlines get smoother, rivers find their true courses, mountain ranges shift to their proper places. Later, cities and villages appear. The shape of the land was there from the beginning, but the resolution improves with every journey. Our African origin story is that map in mid-revision. We have the coastline. We're filling in the rivers. Behind all of this, there's a deeper, quieter point. When scientists say all humans come from Africa, they're not making a statement about modern politics, identity, or worth. They're describing a pattern in bones and stones, in chromosomes and proteins. A pattern that says if you roll the tape of your ancestors back far enough, their paths all converge on the same continent. It doesn't erase the diversity that later emerged. It doesn't flatten out the astonishing variety of cultures, languages, and histories that grew as our species spread. It simply says those differences are recent leaves on a very old tree. A tree that took root in African soil, if this kind of mystery, where evidence is strong on one level and fuzzy on another, fascinates you, there's more to explore. We've put together a book on 12 of the strangest, still unexplained puzzles from human history and prehistory. You can find it on our website. There's a link waiting in the description. And for this week, it's available at a discount if you'd like something calming to read offline. Because our story isn't just where we came from, it's also how much we still don't know. We've traced a path from ancient bottlenecks and branching species through waves of migration and contact to the tangled relationships between genes, languages, and cultures. We've seen where the evidence lines up and where it dissolves into maybes. In the final part of this journey, we'll step back even further. We'll look at what it really means to share a single deep ancestry while walking many different paths. How one species shaped in Africa unfolded into the countless human lives, places, and stories that fill the world today. So now, at the end of this long arc, let's put the pieces together, somewhere in deep time, long before names, before countries, before anyone had a word for Africa. Small bands of our ancestors learned how to survive there. Through climate disasters, genetic bottlenecks, and long stretches of trial and error, they slowly became us. From that base, threads began to unspool, Some wandered out of the continent early and left little trace in today's genomes. Others stayed, divided, merged and innovated across African landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. Eventually, one branch, just one of many, stepped beyond Africa in a way that lasted, spreading into Arabia, Asia, Australia, Europe, and finally the Americas. Along the way, that branch met cousins, Neanderthals in cold Eurasian valleys, Denisovans in mountain plateaus and island chains, maybe other archaic groups whose names we don't yet know. They didn't just compete, they mixed. They borrowed survival tricks as bits of DNA, folded them into their own lineage, and kept moving. Through all of this, the same quiet pattern keeps showing up. Whether you start from skull shapes, buried tools, cave pigments, or the chemistry of ancient bones, whether you begin with mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, or entire sequenced genomes, the trails keep running back, again and again, into that older African web of populations. Not a single garden, not a lone birthplace, a continent-scale network of groups exchanging genes, ideas, and tools over vast stretches of time, gradually accumulating the features we recognize as modern human. That's where the scientific consensus is strongest. Deep roots in Africa, later dispersals outward, repeated episodes of contact and mixing. Inside that frame, we're still working with pencil instead of ink. Exactly which routes were taken across deserts and shorelines. Exactly how many waves of departures left Africa and how they overlapped. Exactly how often migrant bands met and merged with the people they encountered. Those details blur at the edges of what our methods can currently see. One new fossil can shift a date by 50,000 years. One new genome from an unexpected place can reveal a migration we didn't know existed. One reanalysis of a stone tool tradition can redraw lines on the map of our past. So the picture you've been listening to tonight is the best supported version for now, not a finished verdict. If you let that sink in, it has a kind of calm to it. Every person alive today, no matter what language they speak, what country they live in, or how different they seem from anyone else, is part of this same long experiment in survival that began in Africa. Our differences in appearance, our local customs, our many separate histories, their variations that unfolded on top of a shared foundation. The genes in your cells carry echoes of rains returning to old African grasslands, of small rafts crossing narrow seas, of people sheltering in ice age valleys, or testing unknown rivers, or standing on the first beaches of new continents. Geography scattered us. Time diversified us, but the evidence, bones, stones, and DNA together, keeps whispering that underneath all of that, we belong to one story. The story of a species that almost didn't make it, then spread into every environment it could reach. If you found this journey soothing or thought-provoking, you might enjoy going even deeper. We've put together a book exploring 12 of the strangest, most haunting mysteries from prehistory, the kinds of puzzles that sit right at the edge of what we know. You can find it on our website. There's a link waiting in the description if you'd like something calm and curious to read when you're away from a screen. And if you'd like to drift off with more nights like this, you can gently help this channel grow. Tap like if you haven't already. Subscribe so the next story finds you on its own. And when you feel like sharing, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. It's a quiet way of watching those ancient migrations come full circle, tiny messages appearing from all the places our ancestors walked to. For now, let the details loosen and fade. You know that far behind the noise of daily life, there's a single long path that runs through every family line, including yours, back through villages and camps, through nameless bands of travellers, all the way to those early humans standing somewhere in Africa, looking out at a world that was mostly unknown. Their journey became your existence. Their choices became your map. And tonight, For a little while, you've walked that map in reverse, back toward the source, back toward the deep, dark root of the human story before letting it all go, and resting in the simple fact that wherever you are and whoever you are part of that one unfolding path.